Good afternoon. And welcome to what I think is the 16th annual Alice and Frederick LaBrecque Medical Ethics Panel. I'm so grateful for you all, that you've all come. I'm having a hard time negotiating this microphone here. So I'm very grateful for all of you coming. I know it's a busy time of year for everybody. We were able to schedule these three panelists today, and we're really grateful that they were able to find times when their busy schedules all overlap, and we're grateful that you took time out from your final exams and final papers and final committee meetings and all those kinds of things to be here with us today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the number of people. First of all, the family of Alice and Frederick LaBrecque, whose generous donation made it possible for us to have this annual event. I'd like to just ask the family members to stand up and receive recognition for their generosity this year. The annual event, the annual lecture panel is named after their parents, Alice D. and Frederick C. LaBrecque. Frederick LaBrecque was a graduate of Boston College and a very distinguished career as obstetrician, OBGYN doctor. How many children did he deliver? I always forget.
Over 12,000.
Over 12,000 children delivered over the course of his career. So you can see, those of you who are undergraduates here, you can see what your BC degree can do. And I'd also like to thank the members of the LaBrecque Lecture Committee. I'm not sure if they're all here, and I'm probably going to forget some of them, but Professor Kathy Reed, Professor Arthur Madigan, Professor Jorge Garcia, who I don't see here, but I think probably will be here shortly, and I'm forgetting who else I'm forgetting. No, I didn't forget Pam. I wanted to say I'm especially grateful to Pam because this year's forum was her idea, and she was very instrumental in making the connections with our panelists. I started to say panelists for this year. So I'm really grateful, especially this year, for our committee member, Professor Pamela Grace from the School of Nursing, for her help in putting this forum together. And last, and certainly far from least, I want to thank my staff, assistants at the Lonergan Institute. I get to just say, let's do this, and then I walk away and they make it all happen. All the publicity, all the arrangements for locations, all the ferrying of people to and from lodging and airplanes and things like that. Carrie Cronin and Susan Legere and Peggy Bacallo, I want to thank them especially for all the logistical support and all the personal support that they gave us for this event and to me throughout the whole year. So I'd like to ask a hand for them as well. So the original plan of the LaBrecque family was that we would have an annual lecture, but because their donation has done relatively well in the sometimes rocky stock market, we're now able to bring together not just one lecture, but a panel, which we've done for the last couple of years, I think very successfully. And our forum will be as follows. Each of our panelists will speak for 20 minutes on the topic of looking back at the 50 years from the Harvard study, which gave what is for many people the operating definition of brain death and the ethical and philosophical and medical issues that has raised. And after each of them has spoken, so that'll give us 60 minutes, I'll invite them to respond to one another, and then we'll open it up for questions. So we won't have questions after each of the presentations, but there'll be plenty of opportunity for dialogue and conversation after all of our three panelists have spoken. So let me begin by introductions, and the introductions will be in the order that our panelists are going to speak. First of all is Christine Mitchell, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Bioethics at Harvard University and the Harvard Medical School. She received her bachelor's degree and master's degree in science from the Boston University School of Nursing. and a master's degree from Harvard, where she majored in philosophical and religious ethics as a Kennedy Fellow in medical ethics through the Interfaculty Program. She is also an elected fellow of the American Academy of Nurses. Her research has focused on ethics consultation and public engagement in policies regarding resource allocation related to major natural disasters or pandemics. Her recent publications include Nurse and Physician Barriers to Spiritual Care Provision at the End of Life, and Hinduism and Death with Dignity, the Historic and Contemporary Case Examples. Professor Mitchell founded the ethics program at Boston Children's Hospital and was also Associate Director of Clinical Ethics at Harvard Medical School's Division of Medical Ethics, and also an all-volunteer citizen Community Ethics Committee for informed public input into ethical aspects of healthcare and health policies. She leads the monthly Harvard Ethics Consortium discussion of ethics cases and teaches in the Harvard Medical School Ethics Fellowship Program. She has served on numerous national committees and commissions, including the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities Clinical Ethics Consultation Committee, and most recently, the Ethical, Legal, and Social Aspects Committee for the Human Brain Project, funded by the European Commission. She lectures nationally and internationally on issues in clinical ethics. Her published work includes a documentary film made with Ben Achtenberg, which was nominated for an Academy Award. I think this is a first for the LaBrecque Ethics. And a documentary video that received an International Freddie Award for medical media. Our second speaker is Dr. Alan Schumann, who is Clinical Professor Emeritus at the UCLA Department of Pediatrics Division of Neurology. He received his bachelor's degree from Harvard University and his medical degree from New York University Medical School. He has served on the medical staff of California Hospital Medical Center, Providence Tarzana Medical Center, Henry Mayo Newhall Memorial Hospital, Valley Presbyterian Hospital, and Northridge Hospital Medical Center. He's held administrative positions as Chief of Pediatric Neurology, as well as the whole neurology department at Olive View UCLA Medical Center. He co-edited the book, Brain Death and Disorders of Consciousness, Advances in Experimental Medicine and Biology. He has published over 100 articles in medical journals and book chapters on neurological injuries, disorders, and brain death, as well as over 300 essays, lectures, radio and television discussions on ethical issues related to neurological medicine and brain death. Among his many contributions to neurology and ethics, Dr. Schumann has also served on the task force on brain death for the Pontifical Academy of Life. He's been a guest professor at the Department of SUNY Buffalo and consultant to the German Ethics Council in Berlin. And our last presenter, Professor Christopher Tollefson, is Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Department of Philosophy at the University of South Carolina. He received his undergraduate degree from St. Anselm's College in Manchester, New Hampshire, and his doctorate in philosophy from Emory University. His areas of specialization include moral philosophy and practical ethics and the new natural law theory, especially concerning issues such as the nature of human action, the foundations of practical reason, political morality, and the application of natural law thought to applied ethical issues such as the morality of lying, beginning and end of life issues, medical ethics, and the ethics governing inquiry. He's currently doing work on natural law ethics, disability and social justice, liberal perfectionism, philosophical embryology, and ethics in education. Professor Tollefson has taught at the Spiriton Institute of Philosophy in Ghana, and he's been a senior fellow at the Witherspoon Institute and a visiting fellow at the James Madison program, both at Princeton University. and also at the Eudaimonia Institute at Wake Forest University. He is author of the books Lying and Christian Ethics and Biomedical Research and Beyond, Expanding the Ethics of Inquiry. He's also co-author of Embryo, A Defense of Human Life, and editor of Bioethics with Liberty and Justice, Artificial Nutrition and Hydration, A New Catholic Debate, and John Paul II's contribution to Catholic bioethics. This year, he added 4 more articles to his list of over 90 published scholarly articles and hundreds of articles for publication in the public forum. So it's with great pleasure to welcome this esteemed group of people to speak to us about a very, very challenging, difficult, important issue having to do with brain death and the ethical implications of it. Thank you. So I'm going to invite Professor Mitchell. I got the Christine part, the Mitchell part. Right. Elder moment. Brain death assembly. So Professor Mitchell to begin.
Good afternoon. It's lovely to be back here, especially on such a nice sunny day after all this rain. I haven't been back to Boston College for a long time. One of my favorite memories is giving the graduation talk at the School of Nursing one year. I can't remember the exact year, but I did remind myself of my favorite cognitive enhancement device, namely Google, who the president was, and it's when Father Donald Monin was president. So it was a while ago. It's nice to see familiar faces. Thank you to the LaBrecque family. I feel like I've been talking about death rather a lot lately. Last year, because Henry Knowles Beecher, whom I'm going to talk to you about, was at Harvard Medical School, we did a 50th anniversary conference about this topic, both the Beecher report and the issues surrounding defining death. I brought a few of the supplements for that. Don't know where they ended up, but for people who are really deeply interested in this issue, the entire issue has articles that explore some of the things we're going to raise today. And then again this year, we did an annual bioethics conference on controlling death, looking at the practices and policies related to the ability in many cases to determine when and how patients die in healthcare facilities. So I meant to bring my timer since I wanted to stay on time. My task today is to introduce Henry Knowles Beecher to you, and there's a advance clicker. I didn't see a clicker. Use this. Okay. And to talk about, I'll give you a little bit of background about the Harvard Brain Death Committee and some of the ethical questions that remain even now 50 years later. So, as I said, Henry Knowles Beecher was a professor at Harvard. His name actually is one that he chose himself when he was in his 20s, having been born Harry Unans in Peck, Kansas. He did a BA degree and a master's degree in physical chemistry at the University of Kansas before he came to medical school in 1928 and graduated in 32. He practiced for a couple of years under the professor of surgery at Mass General Hospital and then went to Denmark to work in the physiology lab of Nobel laureate August Crow, and came back to Harvard in 1936, where he was named the anesthetist-in-chief, since anesthesiology wasn't quite a field then, at Mass General Hospital. And he became eventually the first individual with an endowed chair in anesthesiology at Harvard Medical School after serving in the Army during World War I. Could that be? No, II. I have an error in my notes. One of the things he's best known for, apart from what I'm going to tell you about the Harvard Brain Death Committee, is a controversial article that he published in 1966 on the ethical violations, in effect, of medical clinical research that was being done in the United States that he showed were not appropriately attentive to the rights of patients. This was before there was an institutional review board and ethics review process in the United States, and this helped to stimulate that. He published 22 cases without naming the medical researchers, but citing the ways in which their research violated what would be appropriate considerations for reducing harm to patients and keeping in mind a proportionate potential for benefit to them. The thing I'm going to talk to you about is the committee that he persuaded the then Dean Ebert of Harvard Medical School to appoint, which was entitled the Ad Hoc Committee of the Harvard Medical School to examine the definition of brain death. This was a committee that had 10 physicians on it, including the then celebrated physician Joseph Murray, who later went on to win a Nobel Prize for his groundbreaking work in kidney transplantation. He had recently transplanted the first pair of identical twins, so those were living related. It was a living-related kidney donor. So there were 10 physicians. There was a lawyer, William Curran, who's was a professor at the Harvard School of Public Health, and a theologian, Ralph Potter, from Harvard Divinity School, and a historian of science. And the purpose of the committee was to define irreversible coma as a new criterion for death. Now, it took a little unpacking to get that to a place where it was distinguished from what we call persistent vegetative state. But I want to focus particularly on the reasons, since they are, first of all, in the report, in the published report in the Journal of the American Medical Association, these two reasons are cited. First, that new measures have begun to save those, quote, whose heart continues to beat but whose brain is irreversibly damaged. And so the report cites the kind of burden that this places on families, hospitals, as well as those who need hospital beds. And also, they explicitly cite the desire to avoid controversy around obtaining organs for transplantation. So you'll remember that this was just beginning to be a practice in the United States, carried out only in a few major medical centers, but it was clear that it was going to be an increasing practice, and transplants of various organs had already begun to occur before there was a clear medical definition of what constitutes brain death, and so this was the purpose of the Brain Death Committee. Well, you can imagine that that was an article that set a lot of people to thinking and talking. Obviously at the beginning within the medical fields, but one of the things that it showed is that the thing we have all grown accustomed to thinking of as an event is actually a process. In the early days of my own practice as a nurse, graduating in 1973 and working in a critical care area, it was the common practice to resuscitate every person who had clearly recently died or for whom you were witnessing a cardiorespiratory arrest. And More and more of them were then, after having been intubated and placed on mechanical ventilators, not getting better. Obviously some did, which is a very good thing, but those who did not, there was still questions about withdrawing ventilators from patients like that. So the reason that the Brain Death Committee report cites is one that was real and was not strictly a matter of obtaining organs for transplantation. So this idea that death doesn't actually happen just at a moment, even though those of you who have sat at bedsides and seen deaths for many patients when there is not effort to reverse a cardiorespiratory arrest, it seems like it happens as an event in a particular moment. When those arrests are witnessed, however, or if you come upon someone very soon after a cardiorespiratory arrest and you make an intervention to resuscitate and intubate them and begin to provide with a machine the capacity to keep their blood oxygenated, even these days establish a way of cleansing and replacing and oxygenating and replacing their blood, called extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. You then have this problem in spades. And so we begin to have the hints that death happens with a number of systems shutting down over time, and the possibility that there may be more than one way to evaluate when someone has died, especially if they are on a respirator already. So what the Harvard Committee cited as the 4 components of determining death were unreceptivity and unresponsivity, no movements or breathing, no reflexes, and a flat EEG. And starting with their report and then slowly moving forward as medical staffs and critical care units, the physicians in critical care units began to apply some of these, they began to develop a much more detailed, necessarily detailed, set of procedures and guidelines for establishing what constituted brain death by looking at various neurological criteria, so that now there's a distinction between circulatory criteria for death and neurological criteria for death. So some of those components of the neurological criteria for determining death are on the right-hand side of this slide, keeping in mind that there are certain conditions that a patient might have which you have to rule out prior to testing for reflexes and checking to see when the ventilator is turned off, whether or not there's any spontaneous recovery of the ability to breathe, and then conducting various other tests which might be neuroimaging, cerebral angiography. Some places also require that there be a waiting period and another assessment of the neurological criteria in establishing brain death. So once the report of the Harvard Brain Death Committee was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and these kinds of practices began to spread of thinking about the possibilities for evaluating death using brain death, not just cardiorespiratory death. As that practice increased and continued, the President's Commission for the Study of Ethical Problems in Medicine and Biomedical and Behavioral Research did, as one of their early reports under the very able leadership of the Executive Director, Alexander Capron, a report entitled Defining Death, Medical, Legal, and Ethical Issues in the Determination of Death in 1981. So this was 5 years let's see, 76, yes, 5 years after the Quinlan case, which was not a matter of brain death, but where there was still these debates about what to do regarding persons who were in the intensive care unit on mechanical ventilation, but irreversibly unconscious. And so this issue about how to define death and what the responsibilities were of the people who were taking care of them was addressed by the President's Commission report, which was immediately followed up by the provision of a model definition of death act, which was distributed to the members of Congress, to the executive branch, to responsible parties at the various states for discussion and introduction into their bodies for approving statutes, and some accepted and some did not. But brain death is now legal in all states, whether by statute or by regulation. And it states that an individual who has sustained either irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions, so the circulatory criteria for death, or irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem, is dead. A determination of death must be made in accordance with accepted medical standards. So the citation for this graphic I put on here is on the bottom of the slide, because there's still some variation from state to state about what the requirements are. I will say, in conversation with Alex Capron and colleagues, it's very clear historically in their memories that as a result of the kind of debate they had about what the medicine was behind this, that it was important to them that they left that open and to the physicians to determine. And so while that introduced the possibility of some variation, it also allowed the possibility that that could be updated, as has been necessary. So that leaves us with the way we usually think about death, that is somatic death. That is, if you came upon a person who wasn't breathing and who had no pulse, and you listened and couldn't hear a heartbeat, or if there had been some great trauma and it's obvious, or it's been a long time and there's decomposition, all those things that are, sort of empirically immediately evident might fit what has been, kind of an ancient understanding of somatic death. And then this idea about circulatory death, criteria for death, or cardiorespiratory death, and neurological or brain death, which of course go together. If your heart's not beating and you're not breathing and your brain isn't being oxygenated, then it isn't getting to places, and of course the brain is therefore going to be affected and die. So this graphic just kind of shows that base of patient whose breathing and heartbeat has stopped, ultimately ending up with a dead brain as well. And some of those patients, if they're in the intensive care unit, and if they're on some form of mechanical ventilation that continues their respiratory, oxygenating their circulation, then you have to look at whether their brain is dead despite mechanical intervention. So, getting back to this question about transplantation, which was linked in the original Brain Death Committee's report, right after this work that was being done around the uniform definition of death, there was also a lot of discussion about the so-called dead donor rule, which includes two ways of stating it. One is, of course, that organ donors have to be dead before procuring organs that are essential for their life, and that organ procurement itself may not be the cause of death of the donor. So the kinds of organs that can be procured from patients who are no longer alive include heart, liver, kidneys, lungs, pancreas, small intestines, and of course all kinds of tissues which don't have to be obtained so quickly. The problem, of course, is that there's a tension between bringing the kind of compassion and sensitivity and dignity and respect for the person who has just died and the grieving family if they're nearby, and the kind of time sensitivity that is necessary for procuring organs that have not started to deteriorate. And so one of the things that made this more functioning is brain death when a patient was already on mechanical ventilation. But you could establish by neurological criteria that they were dead, and therefore take them to the operating room to procure organs. We have now a resurfacing of the discussion about circulatory criteria, since there are more and more patients in our intensive care units who are on forms of life support and yet have not progressed to the standard in the Harvard Brain Death Committee's report of whole brain death. And yet there's a decision by the family that the patient would not want to have been kept alive in this state, and so therefore they refuse on the patient's behalf continued life-sustaining treatment. And if those organs are to be available, we then have to think of a way that they can be monitored when, like the so-called life support, the mechanical ventilation, and medicines are removed, and an effort is made to figure out whether or not the patient dies within an acceptable period of time for procuring organs. And so there is this, in hospitals around the country, discussion and guidelines now in most places for whether that takes place in the intensive care unit or it takes place in the operating room, determining when the patient is dead by circulatory criteria, since this patient didn't meet the criteria while still on mechanical ventilation for brain death, and then whether the time before cardiopulmonary arrest happens is short enough to facilitate procuring organs. I won't go into all the details about uncontrolled donation after unsuccessful efforts to resuscitate patients, but this is being done more in Spain, for example, where there's presumed consent for organ donation, and less here, although there are increasingly protocols for looking at whether or not that could be possibly used as a way to obtain organs for potential transplantation. So, just to finish up, some of the ethical questions that I think we'll want to talk about today, but you may want to raise some of your own. Is death in the eyes of the beholder? What sort of variety, if any, should be permitted in defining death, and the kinds of social behaviors that are associated with death? So, preparing a person who has died for the morgue, sitting and grieving with the family, things like that. Because there's certainly a lot of variety in the social practices. There's a lot of discussion now about whether or not there should be standards, maybe even worldwide, for declaring death. So Another one of these questions is, should there be international definitions of death and standards for medical evaluation of brain death across national boundaries? One question that I didn't give you much background for thinking about, but which I think Dr. Schumann might talk some about, is whether or not the decision maker for the patient or the family who are there should be asked to consent before an evaluation for brain death begins. Because there are at least some persons who are not willing to accept the whole idea of brain death, and in particular are the procedures related to testing for whether or not spontaneous respiration might occur. And so apnea, or the absence of breathing, is a component of the test for brain death. But it doesn't benefit the patient other than to the extent that the patient wouldn't want to be kept alive in this state. So the question is, should consent be required for doing the evaluation of brain death in the first place and for doing apnea testing? One of the common practices in critical care units around the country has become these discussions around when, after brain death testing has been done and is positive, the mechanical support of the patient and the medical support of the patient is going to be withdrawn, and whether or not there is ethical justification for continuing it for some period of time, and then what is the reason that one stops, and what are the justifications for continuing it given that the patient is dead. And an increasing question has been whether medical support should be removed after brain death has been determined, even when the families object. And in particular, what provisions should be made for religious differences, which I think Professor Tolleson might be addressing. So those are some of the ethical questions that we might want to discuss after the presentations. Thank you.
And thank you, Professor Byrne, for the invitation. Thank you, the LaBrecque family, for sponsoring this. It's always a pleasure to be back in Boston. So let me just dive in here. Let me start with something rather provocative, which is the claim that most hospital death certificates actually violate statutory law. How is this possible? Well, Christine already showed us the Universal Determination of Death Act, which I'll read it again with you. An individual who has sustained either irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions or irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem, is dead. Now, I would wager that most hospital deaths are in the situation of do not resuscitate. And when the doctor is legally required to put a time of death on the death certificate, that is timed to the moment of permanent cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions. which is not the same as the time of irreversible cessation. Because the cessation could be reversed, but there was an ethical decision not to reverse it. So most hospital deaths do not correspond to the UDDA. Nevertheless, no one has a problem with this discrepancy. Curious, huh? So when does death actually occur? I would say it depends on what is meant by death. And personally, I favor a dual concept of death, which I don't have time to tell you about in these 20 minutes. So if you're interested, you can ask me in the Q&A session. But this talk will explore when, in my opinion, death does not occur. So Christine already introduced us to the Harvard Committee, so I won't rehash what she said, but just to emphasize that there was no rationale offered why irreversible coma should be death, other than its utility and societal relativism. And interestingly, the title of the report, A Definition of Irreversible Coma, is contradictory to the content of the report, which proposes that as a criterion of death, because comatose patients are by definition alive. Corpses are not comatose. So the report itself is, has many logical problems. Here's the President's Commission report, which in 1981 was the same year as a seminal report by Jim Burnett and his colleagues Colbert and Gert, where they proposed the tripartite distinction between the concept of death, the diagnostic criterion for death, and the diagnostic tests for death. And they proposed that death is the concept of death is the permanent cessation of functioning of the organism as a whole. That's pretty much the concept that the President's Commission adopted in its seminal monograph. They considered the concept to be the traditional concept of death, which is essentially biological, and that there was one concept of death. There was just one death, but two clinical contexts and corresponding methods of diagnosing it. That's what they proposed. Now, in addition, there have been many advocates of what we could call a mentalist concept of death, or higher than that, which the President's Commission rejected. And that idea is that the human person is essentially a mind, and that irreversible unconsciousness per se equals death of the person, even if the body remains biologically alive. In other words, according to this concept, there is no such thing as an irreversibly comatose person, because it wouldn't be a person anymore. And this is actually the implicit rationale for many advocates of brain death today, which we know this from surveys of neurologists and other physicians. I think there are a number of problems with this mentalist concept of death. Why wouldn't temporary unconsciousness not be the annihilation and recreation of the person/mind? And what if the temporary unconsciousness lasts indefinitely? What about irreversible unconsciousness with a structurally intact brain? How can that be? Well, say somebody who is terminally moribund with cancer, has maybe a week to live, and is comatose due to all the organ dysfunction and toxins floating around in the blood, maybe septic shock. This person is irreversibly unconscious, but with a structurally intact brain. So is that person already dead? And at the bottom of all of this, I think the mentalist concept of death conflates a form of severe disability with death itself. Okay, so I'm not going to talk anymore about the mentalist concept. There's a novel concept of death proposed in 2008 by the President's Council on Bioethics, which is, in their words, that the organismal wholeness depends on the fundamental vital work of a living organism, the work of self-preservation achieved through the organism's need-driven commerce with the surrounding world. And they propose that the brain-dead body does not have this fundamental vital work because it's both unconscious and does not breathe. So I'm not going to talk any more about that either because for lack of time. But if you're interested, you can read this essay that I wrote in the Hastings Center report shortly after that council report came out. So let's look at the concept, criteria, and tests of death according to this tripartite scheme that Burnett and colleagues proposed. When I gave the talk at the Harvard conference last year, I proposed that there are incoherent relationships all the way around this triangle. And today I'm going to discuss just that one. And if you're interested in the other ones, you can ask me during the Q&A session. So the criterion, the brain criterion for death does not really correspond with the concept of death as a biological concept. And I'll tell you why. So using Burnett's concept, the permanent cessation of functioning of the organism as a whole, and then he updated that to say permanent cessation of the critical functions of the organism as a whole. Either way, the criterion, as we've heard, is the Universal Determination of Death Act, the irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain. And the rationale for that, given by Burnett and colleagues and by the President's Commission, is that the brain is the master integrator of the organism. So without the brain's keeping the body coordinated, the body literally disintegrates. Now, what is the evidence for that rationale? That is twofold. Number one, the patients who are brain dead have imminent cardiovascular collapse. No matter what technological tour de force is applied, they go ahead and soon have cardiac arrest despite all of that, which is held up as proof that they were already dead. The other line of evidence is what we could call a litany or list of integrative brain functions that these patients lack. So let's look at the alleged imminence of cardiovascular collapse after brain death. So in 1981, the President's Commission wrote that even with extraordinary medical care, these vital functions cannot be sustained indefinitely, typically not longer than several days. Now, we now know that that is not true. And the causes of the acute instability in brain death are multiple that have nothing to do with lack of brain function. So these patients, many of them, have direct damage to vital organs by the initial etiology, especially cardiac arrest. Damages kidneys, heart, liver, all kinds of things. Massive trauma is another common cause of brain death. Massive trauma often damages other organs besides the brain. There can be secondary damage to vital organs from sympathetic storm during brain herniation. So I won't go into the medical details of what that is, but as the brain is swelling and herniating out the base of the skull into the spinal column, before that is completed, sympathetic nervous system is sending out massive signals, the kind of emergency response signals that result in vasoconstriction and damage to other organs from that vasoconstriction, particularly the heart. There is often a widespread inflammatory reaction throughout the body in these patients, which destabilizes things. There's autonomic dysfunction from spinal shock. So every time there's brain death, the spinal cord behaves just as it does in high spinal cord injury. So the cord below that injury shuts down temporarily, lasts a week or two, and gradually recovers. But during the acute phase, the spinal cord is not working. And so that causes autonomic dysfunction, low blood pressure, and so on. There is often endocrine problems, so thyroid and renal insufficiency. So all of this added together, no wonder these patients are unstable and difficult to manage. None of this has anything to do with the brain being the master integrator of the body. So why is chronic brain death so rare? Well, first of all, the diagnosis of brain death is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So patients who are diagnosed with that either are withdrawn from ventilators, or if they're organ donors, then organs are obtained, and that's the end of it. Moreover, in 99.999% of cases, there's no motivation to maintain support of these patients, and so the life support is withdrawn if they're not going to be organ donors. So the rarity of chronic brain death does not imply that the brain is therefore the master integrator of the body, right? So I've been fascinated by cases of chronic brain death. I've collected these over the years because they go against the common wisdom in the medical profession, certainly against what the President's Commission thought in 1981. So here's an example of a patient known in the literature as TK. He became brain dead at age 4 from bacterial meningitis. And his mother did not accept brain death. And this was diagnosed at a time when there were no pediatric diagnostic criteria for brain death. So doctors were reluctant to give him that label and force the issue like has been done with more recent cases where parents refused the concept. So he was kind of carried along and was labeled in the medical chart as comatose or in a PBS or whatever, but he actually met the criteria for brain death that we have now. And here's his MRI scan at age, not at age, but 13.9 years after brain death. And you can see that there's nothing left of the brain in there. So it's just a jumble of tissues and fluids. He survived in this state for over 20 years. And at autopsy, the skull was full of this grumous material. On microscopic examination, there was no neuron identifiable anywhere in the skull. So this patient was clearly brain dead. He had no brain. Nevertheless, he grew. So here are his growth charts. He grew in height and weight, and he did not grow like a tumor grows, chaotically. He grew like a boy grows, proportionally. Here's another case. This is a Japanese boy whom I saw. Actually, I saw both of these in person. This Japanese boy became brain dead at age 1 from an infection. And here is his MRI scan around 5 years into brain death. Again, there's nothing left of the brain. Here's his growth chart. And I would show you pictures of him, except that his mother prefers that they not be shown. But I've seen him, and he develops like a beautiful child, except that he's on a ventilator. So, of course, these are rare, remarkable cases, but they tell us something about the nature of the brain's relationship with the body, and whether the brain is necessary for the body to be an organism. So let's look at this line of integration, if you will. On the left, we have a healthy organism. On the right, we have a decomposing corpse. And somewhere in the middle is death. And just to the left of death, we have a moribund, integrated organism as a whole. And just to the right of death, we have an unintegrated collection of organs and tissues. So the question is, what side of that line does brain death fall on? I've proposed 2 criteria for deciding this, because we have no measure for degree of integration. There's no test that you can do. No machine will give you a number that says it's 3.2 levels of integration. No such thing. So criterion 1 is integrative unity is possessed by a putative organism if it possesses at least one emergent holistic level property. And by emergent, we mean the property derives from the mutual interaction of the parts. And by holistic, the property is not predicable to any part or subset of parts, but only of the entire composite. Now, there are a number of holistic properties in these chronic brain death patients. They have homeostasis, so they regulate the levels of electrolytes and chemicals in the blood and fluid balance and all of that without monitoring and adjustment. They assimilate nutrients and eliminate waste. They have temperature maintenance. They have cardiovascular and autonomic regulation. They have wound healing. They have proportional growth. One patient had onset of puberty. They can have febrile responses to infection. They have a relative paucity of complications, interestingly, and they can recover from medical crises. So if this is not an organism as a whole, I don't know what it is. Criterion 2 is a relative criterion. So any body requiring less technological assistance to maintain its vital functions than some similar body that is nevertheless a living whole must possess at least as much integration and hence also be a living whole. In other words, if A has more integration than reference entity B, and B is on the whole side of the dividing line, then A is necessarily also on the whole side of the dividing line. It's simple geometry. Now, consider A, one of these chronic brain death patients, who's at home, on a ventilator, stable, does not require pressor medications, intestines and all the viscera are functioning normally, has enteral tube feedings, requires few medications and relatively simple management, basically nursing care and ventilator. Compare that with reference entity B, who is an end-stage cancer patient in septic shock, comatose on a ventilator, but not brain dead. So this patient is in an ICU, is unstable, is deteriorating, is pressure dependent, has kidney and liver failure, is in disseminated intravascular coagulation. The intestines are not functioning properly, so cannot incorporate nourishment the usual route. Is on multiple medications and has very complex management. Nevertheless, B is alive. Therefore, if we apply criterion 2, A is certainly alive. We might get some more insight by considering brain-body disconnection. So the body can lose the coordinating influence of the brain in two ways, either by non-function or destruction of the brain, as in brain death, or by disconnection from the brain. And that disconnection can be either functional, such as in severe Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is an inflammation of the nerves and nerve roots that can be so severe that it can actually clinically mimic brain death. Or the disconnection can be structural, such as in high spinal cord transection. And interestingly, this results in exactly the same somatic dysfunctions as in acute brain death. So you can take a chapter on the ICU management of high spinal cord injury and a chapter on the ICU management of brain dead organ donors and interchange the words spinal cord injury and brain death, and the chapters would be identical. Now, if the brain disconnected body is an organism as a whole, which everybody would admit it is, so is the brain dead body. The only difference is consciousness. So, when does death occur? Well, ask me in the Q&A. When does death not occur? I would say when the brain alone is non-functional. Rather, brain death is indeed irreversible coma, as the Harvard Committee proposed, but it is not death. It's a deep coma. And comatose patients are alive and severely disabled. Thank you.
Can everyone hear? Is this good? I'm just going to stay here. It's bad fortune for me to go after you. I'm very grateful for the invitation to be here, and very, very pleased to be on this panel. And I'd like to thank the LaBrecque family for the invitation. It's really a great honor. And I'm going to talk. My remarks are going to have three parts. And the first, I'm going to very briefly explain why I think that brain death really is death. So there will be some disagreement, certainly, on the panel. The second, I'm going to respond to a recent essay by Peter Singer, in which he argues that new insights into brain death, the insights specifically of Dr. Schumann, constitute a significant challenge to the notion of the sanctity of human life. Obviously, if brain death really is death, as I think, that challenge is met. But I'll try to respond to Singer on the supposition that Dr. Schumann is correct. And third, I'll briefly raise some matters that I think should be of mutual concern to defenders of the sanctity of life, even when they disagree about whether brain death really is death. Now, I agree, so this is part one, I agree that the evidence marshaled by Dr. Schumann is interesting, it's profound, it's disturbing. It creates great difficulties for the claim that the brain is the master integrating organism. Although some people who disagree with him, such as Maureen Kondik, have tried to meet those difficulties head on, so to say, arguing that brain death really is death because it is, in fact, the demise of the integrated organism. A different line of thought arguing against Dr. Schumann is proposed by Germaine Grisey and Pat Lee. They've argued that brain death is really the death of a human being, but that there might nevertheless remain a non-human, and indeed non-mammalian but still living organism after brain death. It's non-mammalian and therefore non-human because the brain-dead organism, they argue, is radically incapable of sensation. There's no root capacity for sensation, as there is the root capacity for sensation in a developing embryo, human embryo. Root because it will eventually fulfill its potential and give rise to the active capacity for sensation. There's no such potential, they argue, in a brain-dead individual. And they believe that, and argue that, sensation is a necessary condition for rationality. So they argue in consequence that a being incapable of sensation therefore can't be a rational animal, which is what a human being is, and therefore whatever sort of organism it is that remains as a whole after brain death, it's not a human being in the relevant sense. So that's their argument. Now my argument takes no stand on which of these two approaches is correct, which is a virtue, but it's a philosophical argument, which will probably, and I think not unreasonably, be seen as a vice. It doesn't have the scientific credentials that Dr. Schumann's argument has. And it also relies on, as many, many, many arguments in this domain do, on suppositions about detached brains, for instance. Even arguments in your own career going back to the 1980s, I think, to which my argument bears some similarities. And so it's a little bit, I mean, making this argument feels to me a little bit, and people, anybody here remember Rocky and Bullwinkle? Yeah. Right? It feels a little bit like Bullwinkle saying, watch me pull a rabbit out of the hat. And then Dr. Schumann would say, that trick never works. This time, for sure. So suppose that your organism was reduced down to a mere living brain. Your brain is kept on life support while all your other organs are lost. That seems conceivable, and it seems to me that if it happened, then you would exist as your brain. The human being that you are would be radically disabled, of course, but you would still exist so long as your brain continued to live, right? You would exist as a brain in a vat. I think the first brain in a vat argument came from Hilary Putnam at that school that Dr. Schumann referred to early in an earlier conversation as that little college across the river. You know what I mean. Now, if you think that, right, if you think that you really would exist as your brain, then I think that you should also think that if, as Grisey and Lee suppose, right, the rest of your body was not destroyed, it was sutured and ventilated, and continued to exist as a residual living organism, whatever kind of organism it was, right, we'll call that your brain complement. And if it continued to exist with some capacity to maintain its own biological life, even though obviously it was also on life support, that organism would not be you. Because of course you would be existing as your living brain. And you can't be in both places, existing as two different organisms. So there's two organisms in this scenario, the brain in the vat, that's you, and then we'll suppose that this other organism is in fact continuing to exist. We maintain it alive, and it is an integrated, single, whole, living organism. Still, we should all agree that it's not you. Now that means, I think, that if after some accident, this is a new situation, there is a residual living organism, but no living brain, then the residual living organism can't be you. Because whether you live or not as the residual organism can't depend upon what happens to something else. That is, it can't depend on whether you continue to exist as a brain or not. That is, just to make this a little bit clearer, right? In the case where you do exist as an independent living brain, that's you, right? And you're not the other organism, right? We can't say that Well, as long as the brain doesn't continue to exist, then you could exist as this other organism, the brainless organism. Because whether you're that or not, whether you continue to exist as that or anything, can't depend upon whether you're existing as some other thing. Right? It really has to involve only a relationship between you and the entity that we're wondering about. So if you ever could exist as a living brain, then you could never exist as a living brain complement. I think that's an argument against, or an argument for, brain death as death. Now, as I said, it's a philosophical argument. And although I think it is sound, and it convinces me, it does seem to me that the evidence that Dr. Schumann presents is extremely strong. Right? I certainly would not say that anybody who agrees with that evidence and draws the same conclusions as Dr. Schumann is being unreasonable. I think they're being very reasonable, although I would disagree with them. There's room for what we could call reasonable disagreement here. And as the case of Jahai McMath, who has not been mentioned so far, but might be familiar to some of you, indicates, and this is the focus of much of Peter Singer's essay, which I'm about to discuss, and the case was also studied by Dr. Schumann, indicates that there are certainly difficulties in the diagnosis of brain death. So there are areas of uncertainty in this domain that I think result in an importance of treading carefully in this area. So that's part one. And then part two, I think we should tread carefully enough that it's worth considering what the implications might be if I'm wrong. And these are implications that Peter Singer thinks that he has spelled out in a recent article titled "The Challenge of Brain Death or the Challenge of Brain Death for the Sanctity of Life." Now, I want to consider that challenge since the sanctity of life doctrine is one that I think is true. Singer and I agree, I think, maybe with one minor nuance, with what that doctrine holds, that it's always wrong, quote, these are Singer's words, intentionally to end the life of an innocent human being, end quote. In fact, I hold a stronger view that it's always wrong to intend the death of any human being, regardless of innocence. But we can put that nuance to the side. Now, the old view of brain death, Singer notes, made it possible for Catholic proponents of the sanctity of human life to endorse or engage in the taking of vital organs of individuals who, because brain dead, were no longer considered to be living human beings, even though their hearts continued to beat. Taking their organs on that view did not constitute intentional killing or any kind of killing, since they were already dead. But the situation changes if brain dead patients are not really dead. Isn't taking their vital organs intentional killing? And in fact, things are even worse for the Catholic view, given Singer's understanding of the underlying presupposition of the sanctity of human life. That is, he thinks that the underlying presupposition is the absolute equality of value of all human lives. And he asks, how could it even be proportionate to withdraw life-preserving support from a brain-dead patient who might live 10 or 20 more years, since he's not suffering and the resources are not needed to suffer to save somebody else? Now let me address the second worry of Singer's first. Does it follow from the sanctity of life view that maintaining the life of a brain-dead patient is ordinary rather than extraordinary care, and thus obligatory? I don't think that follows. The standard by which benefits and burdens are to be judged, proportionate or not, thus generating judgments of ordinary and extraordinary, is the standard provided by the caregiver's personal vocation. And that vocation often includes many other responsibilities beyond care for the brain-dead patient. That care is not quite, I think, as inexpensive as Singer sometimes seems to suppose in his essay, and it's certainly time-consuming. The benefit of sustained life is real, since life is always good, but it is minimally realized, and many other benefits are foregone in continuing care. While I think the case is very strong that nutrition and hydration, which are inexpensive and aspects of basic care, should be provided to a patient in a persistent vegetative state, ventilation for someone in a permanent coma or brain death does not seem to me ordinarily to be obligatory. Well, what about taking the organs of a patient who's brain dead, but let us suppose is still a living organism? Singer thinks that any taking of vital organs from a still living patient must involve intentional killing of that patient. He believes such intentional killing can be justified if it's consented to, but he thinks that the defender of the sanctity of life is stuck with being unable to justify the taking of vital organs while the patient is still alive. And it seems to me that Pope John Paul II would have agreed with Peter Singer. Here's a quotation from John Paul. "Acknowledgement of the unique dignity of the human person has a further underlying consequence. Vital organs which occur singly in the body can be removed only after death, that is, from the body of someone who is certainly dead. This requirement is self-evident, since to act otherwise would mean intentionally to cause the death of the donor in disposing of his organs. This gives rise to one of the most debated issues in contemporary bioethics, as well as to serious concerns in the minds of ordinary people. I refer to the problem of ascertaining the fact of death. When can a person be considered dead with complete certainty?" End quote. So that's all a quotation from Pope John Paul II, now Saint John Paul II. Now, as it happens, the Pope believed that brain death did signify, with adequate certainty, the death of the person. And Dr. Schumann disagrees with Pope John Paul on this, as I think is his prerogative. It's, in some ways, clearly a scientific question. Scientific evidence matters. But I think it's also possible to disagree with the Pope on another claim present in the paragraph that I just read, namely the claim that it's self-evident that to take vital organs from a still living human being would be to, quote, intentionally cause the death of the donor, end quote. I'm not sure that Pope John Paul is correct on this. Patrick Lee and Robert P. George seem correct to me when they say the following. So here's another quotation. "Suppose someone has signed a DNR and he suffers a systole. After a short period, one can be sure that his heart would not restart on its own. One would be able to restart it, perhaps, but the patient has signed a DNR, and so members of the hospital staff are not going to do so. In such a situation, even if the patient is still alive, extracting his organs, perhaps including his heart if it's viable, will not hasten his death. Here, death is not intended either as an end or a means. Not only that, one does not even cause or hasten the patient's death as a side effect. One does not cause or hasten his death at all," end quote. Now, this is referring to the permanence rather than drawing on the idea of permanence rather than irreversibility in a definition of death. And I think, right, that if you are going to be strict about a definition of death, it really is irreversibility and real irreversibility, not just pragmatic irreversibility, that does mark the moment of death. Permanence doesn't do it. The fact of permanence that you won't be resuscitated. And so it seems to me that that Lee and George are correct in identifying a patient from whom organs are taken under these circumstances as, in fact, alive in the remaining moments of life, but still alive. Right? So as I say, note that Lee and George hold that even if the patient is still alive, death need not be intended, contrary to John Paul II's very strong claim otherwise. Now, I think that in making this claim that death need not be intended, they're correct. And what they say, I think, and we could talk more about this in Q&A, is both more in keeping with the Catholic tradition of thought on intention and double effect, and also with Pope John Paul II's own thought on the first-person approach to identifying somebody's intention and action. I think it might even be possible to make a stronger claim, although this is just only suggesting this possibility. Even if death were possibly hastened in this circumstance that Lee and George are discussing, right? Or at least in circumstances in which you might not be sure that death was being hastened. The risk of hastening would itself also be a side effect and not necessarily intended. Some variants of the Pittsburgh Protocol, in which you wait for 2 minutes, have drawn controversy for a relatively brief waiting period utilized before organs are taken. I'm not sure that controversy is justified from the natural law standpoint. Finally, I agree with Singer that consent would eliminate the injustice of the organ taking, subject to some caveats that I'll mention in my third set of remarks. For it's a commonplace of the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition of ethics that one can't do injustice to oneself, and therefore neither can what is done to one with one's consent be an injustice. So if there really is consent, then the injustice of taking organs in the remaining moments of life would be alleviated. So it's not clear to me that it would be wrong to rely on prior consent to organ taking in the event that one might be rightly diagnosed as brain dead, yet have also signed a DNR order. The taking of the organs wouldn't necessarily involve an intention to kill, even if those involved accepted as a side effect the risk that death might be hastened in some cases. It seems to me that responds to Singer's challenge to the sanctity of life. Making better assessment of what's actually intended is what needs to be done. Now, part 3, which is very brief, that of course does not mean that it's obligatory to give one's prior consent to such organ taking. My argument proceeded on the supposition that brain death is not really death, but also depended upon a particular and disputable claim about human action, that taking vital organs of a perhaps still living but brain-dead human being need not involve intentional killing, and a moral claim that it also need not involve injustice if consent has been given. In my final remarks, I want to raise three issues that I think still need more scrutiny. The first is that, particularly given the controversies over brain death, I think the standards for consent to organ donation should be stricter. Right now, as explained by the bioethicist Anna Iltis, a friend of mine, the standard used is that of authorization rather than consent. And there's little reason to suppose that most or even many people who consent to donate their organs after brain death know anything about the current controversies over brain death. It seems likely that some people might change their minds if they did know about those controversies, and that is a good reason for securing their genuine consent, giving them more information and requiring that they be more serious about what they're doing when they sign a consent form. The second issue is the issue of religious liberty, which Christine referenced. Jahai McMath's mother moved her to New Jersey from California because there, religious objections to brain death are sufficient to override a declaration of death. And that, again, seems a reasonable accommodation to me, to those who dissent from the orthodoxy about brain death. Third, not too long ago, family members such as parents were effectively given a veto against their children's or spouses' stated consent to organ donation. That veto power has been eroded under pressure to obtain more organs. And I think that's a mistake. I think close family members have a natural moral authority as regards the care of their deceased relatives' bodies. And it's easy to think of circumstances, I think, in which, despite the consent of the organ donor, especially consent as it exists today as mere authorization, it would be quite reasonable for a family member, such as a spouse or parent, to refuse organ donation. Parents might have religious objections not shared by children, vice versa, or a spouse might be concerned about the effects of organ donation, given what seems to be a still living body, on young children. Close family vetoes, I think, should be honored. I argue this in a forthcoming essay in the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy on family authority. I think addressing each of these three issues adequately should be common ground between defenders of the sanctity of life and nevertheless disagree about brain death. They should and do also find common ground in their response to those such as Peter Singer, who reject the sanctity of life and its principled opposition to intentional killing of the innocent, and to those who adopt what I call here a more personist, but if you call them mentalist, account of the human being, and who are willing to count as dead not simply those diagnosed with whole brain death, but also those whose higher brain functions are significantly impaired. I think in the end, that means that these two parties, defenders of the sanctity of human life, who think that brain death really is death, and those who think that it's not, actually agree on much more than they disagree. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a very rich and informative discussion. I know some people have to leave for classes and other kinds of things, so I think it's nice for people who have to do that. So thanks so much for your presentations, all of you. And I'd like to open by asking each of you if you would like to respond to the comments of the other panelists.
Well, somebody's bound to ask you when you think death does actually occur. So let's just get that one out of the way.
Can you give me 5 minutes?
Okay, sure.
Oh, you have a slide? You really did set that up.
I was wondering who was going to ask that question.
So Alan, would you agree that it's a process, or you still think it's an event?
Okay, I'll get there. So, in 2004, I co-authored this article with my wife, who is a linguist, about the semiotics of death. And interestingly, when we surveyed world languages, we found that there are languages that have no equivalent for our English word death. And there are other languages that have more than one word that we would translate as death. Now, Wittgenstein wrote, the limits of my language signify the limits of my world. And it seemed to us that part of the problem with this whole intractable debate about brain death is that our thinking about death is limited by our English language that we grew up in and that we think in. So, over the years, I've come to agree with Robert Veitch and Lainey Ross on a dual concept of death. They distinguish what they call normative and ontological death. So normative is these behaviors that Christine mentioned. Breathing, life insurance kicks in, wills kick in, a person becomes a widow or a widower, the vice president becomes president, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this is distinct from ontological death, which is a metaphysical concept, which I think Chris was trying to get at and the President's Commission was trying to get at. They're not necessarily the same moment or even the same concept. So in 2010, I published this article which proposed a paradigm shift in our thinking about death. So I think these two moments that Veitch and Ross called normative and ontological, they are equally real moments that mark the end of life, just as there are two equally real moments that mark the beginning of life, namely conception and birth. And to get away from the semantic baggage associated with the word death, I proposed using the terms passing away and deanimation. Now, passing away or being deceased is what Veitch would call normative death. It's a socio-legal concept, whereas deanimation is an ontological concept, the loss of the soul or the organizing principle of the body. Passing away has to do with the relationship with others, whereas deanimation has to do with one's relationship to oneself, to one's own body. Passing away is the mirror image of birth, whereas deanimation is the mirror image of conception. And the criterion for passing away is the permanent cessation of consciousness and circulation, whereas the criterion for deanimation is the irreversible cessation of the anti-entropic exchange with the environment, which makes something a living organism. And that is dependent on circulation of oxygenated blood. So passing away is observable and it's operationally definable. Deanimation is not observable or operationally definable. The tests for passing away could be many, but one plausible one would be that circulation did not in fact resume during the potential for autoresuscitation. A test for deanimation, in principle, could be that the observation time is greater than the minimum duration of absent circulation beyond which diffuse cellular damage is extinguished anti-entropic potential. Passing away could be an ethically valid basis for non-heart beating organ donation, as Chris was talking about. And I totally agree with the ethical propriety of that. And it is, in fact, a type of donation inter vivos, but ontological vivos. Do you see the difference? So they're normatively dead, they've passed away, they're deceased, even if the soul is somehow still there for another half hour or so. And deanimation is what mainstream brain death theory tried to force brain death to correspond to, but unsuccessfully, in my opinion. And with passing away, the dead donor rule could be interpreted as the deceased donor rule. You still have the acronym. And deanimation is in fact not even relevant to transplantation. So there you have it.
Okay, any other questions from the panelists for each other?
I have a question for Chris.
About 5 minutes.
So, with the brain in the vat experiment, we've both thought a lot about that. I have two problems with it. And as one who endorsed the thought experiment a long time ago, I came to have these two problems. One is we're making an assumption that the brain in the vat is conscious and is the same conscious, desiring, understanding person. That's an assumption for which we have no evidence. So the thought experiment is based on something for which we have no empirical evidence. But more importantly, even if it is the case that the brain in the vat is the thinking person, what the thought experiment establishes, and of course it would be highly unethical to ever do that thought experiment, but as a philosophical exercise, what the thought experiment establishes is that the brain dead part of it, the body without the brain, would be kind of like a clone of the person. So if you take a single cell from you or me and clone it in some technology that we don't have quite yet, but it's on the way, then that clone is kind of like my identical twin, although not the same age anymore. So the brain dead body would be, in my opinion, would be like a clone of the person. So I totally agree with you that it's not the person, it's not the same person, but that doesn't mean that it's not a human being, or even a human person. So that could be a permanently unconscious clone of myself. So therefore, I think the thought experiment breaks down.
So let me say something about the second objection first. Back in the days of the President's Council on Bioethics, when they were discussing embryos and cloning, Paul McHugh coined the word clonode to talk about human clones, which he thought were not human beings. They needed to have some separate designation. And I thought that was a big mistake. How do we know that a human clone is actually a human person? Well, we look at the genetics and the epigenetics of it, and then we also look to see what its natural history is. And we have pretty good evidence that a cloned sheep actually is a sheep. the natural history bears that out. It developed and grew as a sheep, and I think we would see the same if we were able to track the natural history of a cloned human being and also able to look at its genetic and epigenetic profile. So that's how you tell that something that's cloned is what you've cloned. Is it a human being or is it something else? You could perform, induce pluripotent stem cell technology in order to create something that's like a clone, but it's obviously not a human being because it's not following the same trajectory. And it seems to me that the clone analogy is a good one for the brain dead, or for the brainless but still alive and maintained human body. It is a little bit like a clone. It's like a little bit like a twin that has arisen through a kind of fission, but it's not a human being. It does not have, it never will have that same natural life history. It's not going to develop a brain. It doesn't have the same radical capacity that an early human embryo has to develop as a human being to eventually reach a stage of consciousness. So it seems like it's a different sort of clone. It is cloned in a sense. It emerges from a kind of fission, but we don't need to think of it as a human being, and hence we don't need to think of it as a human person. I think on the first question, just very quickly, what is the evidence that that a living brain maintained would have some form of consciousness? It obviously wouldn't have the same form of consciousness that we're familiar with, but it seems to me that there is obviously, the brain is foundational for consciousness. And so it seems reasonable to think that that brain would have some form of highly distorted and disabled consciousness, but nevertheless some form of consciousness.
I tend to agree with you on that point.
I don't normally do this. As moderator, I've never asked a question of my own, but I'm going to do it today. And it's mainly perhaps directed toward Dr. Schumann, but certainly I'm interested in the responses from any of the panelists. What if we change the language? This would be somewhat my preferred change the language. Instead of the brain as the integrating organ of the body, which I think, personally, I think is a mistake to talk that way. I would talk about the human way of integrating the body. Okay, that gets us into a lot longer discussion than we have for now. And that the brain is an indispensable part of that. So that at brain death, there's still an integration of the body, but it's no longer a human integration of the body. Because, as I assume we all agree, having a brain as a component of the body is essential for the kind of integration of the body that manifests in human behaviors, human intelligence, speech, action, decision-making, social intercourse, other kinds of things we could put on that list. So that with brain death, that doesn't mean that there's no longer an organic integration of that body, but there's no longer human integration of that body. And I think it gets, I think thinking of the brain as the integrating organ of the body as opposed to the body as a whole, including its brain, as having a certain kind of integration might be a way of thinking about this. And if I could add sort of maybe a corollary to that with regard to Chris's idea about the separation of a brain and a body, and that the brain would still have consciousness and so on, in response to Professor Schumann's objection or question about the evidence for that. Evidence is complicated, but we do have some evidence that points in the direction of what argument I think Chris is tending toward. And that is people who are severely disabled, who have been severely disabled for large portions of their lives, who have been unable to communicate with recent technological developments of the kinds of things that have enabled very, very severely disabled people through eye movements, for example, to be able to form sentences through computer-assisted technology. They tell us about what they have been doing during the period when it looked as though they had no connection between their brains and their bodies. So we do have some evidence that what Chris is suggesting might be correct. So just maybe those two proposals, any responses either you or the other panelists might have to that.
Yeah, as I said, I tend to agree that the brain in the vat is likely conscious. for some of the reasons that you said. So,
Although without a body, it has no source of perceptions, so it has no
Right.
information about the external world.
absolutely. So all it has is imaginations and memories and desires. But anyway, getting to the issue of integration in a human way, that's an interesting idea. But one thing that we haven't really defined here, none of the four of us so far, is what is meant by brain death. So let's say you have a patient who is almost brain dead and is irreversibly unconscious, who doesn't have any of these interactions that you mentioned as part of human integration, but has a gag reflex. So it's not brain dead. So if the criterion is total brain death, then that patient is alive. But if the criterion is thinking and acting in an integrated way, then the patient is not. So I guess we have to define what we mean even by brain death, which is a poor term to begin with, because it can mean either death by neurological criterion or can mean death of or necrosis of the brain as an organ. And it's just not clear what it even means.
Okay, let me open it up to the audience. And, I'm going to call on Megan LaBrecque because I usually call on another member of the LaBrecque family.
This is, in some senses, a minor point, but for Chris, and this does not indicate if that I agree or disagree, but just thinking about the philosophical road. As far as the discussion about DNR and not being able to do injustice to oneself and those kinds of things, I feel like that leads down to the path of the ethical questions about suicide, or those examples of definitely terminal cancer patients using chemotherapy or not, that would buy them for 6 more months of life. That, I feel like it starts leading into that gray territory because it is a similar kind of a thing, just sort of shortening the inevitable, but, it's, I think, am I explaining myself?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I think that's actually very helpful, because one of the ways that I think some people go wrong in thinking about this is in thinking that when, say, a form of treatment that could preserve life for some further period of time is refused, right, that because that refusal plays a causal role in hastening death, that therefore the patient intended that their life be ended sooner, or that they be killed, or that it's some form of suicide. And I think that's not, in fact, that's not the Catholic view about this. When one says no, right, if one's doing this in an upright way to some form of treatment that might extend one's life, one is actually saying no to the burdens that are brought about by that treatment, the cost, for instance, or the side effects that the treatment. One's not saying no to the life that will be preserved. And that's why I said in my remarks that I thought that Lee and George are actually a little bit closer to the Catholic tradition on thinking about intention than Pope John Paul was in that particular remark. Having even a causal effect on the shortening of life is not enough to say that one has intended that shortening of life. One accepts the shortening as a side effect in the case where one is saying no to the to the consequences of treatment, to the burdens of treatment that one thinks are problematic. And so I think that a similar thought is available over here in taking the organs of somebody in this particular condition that I've described. The intention is not to kill them in order to get the organs. The intention is to take the organs in order to do other good things. One's doing that with their permission. And if there is a risk of hastening, one can accept that risk as a side effect, but not intend to be hastening the death in that particular case. A lot of philosophers will say that they'll make the collapse, and then they'll argue that because whenever you refuse treatment, you're intending to hasten your death or intending to die, that therefore everybody accepts that intending people's death is okay, and so we should do away with the dead donor rule, and we should, allow harvesting of organs of people who are alive just so long as they've said yes to it. And I think that's a mistake to collapse those two notions. Is that helpful?
Douglas?
There's a second round.
Thanks, Hey, I think everyone has been in agreement for a long time that withdrawal of care in end-stage disease is perfectly acceptable. And often in tragic situations, usually accidents and things of this sort of brain aneurysms, things where there is no possible return to brain function, one of the few things that gives the family of this tragic situation any solace is the ability to donate, because their child, their spouse, is helping someone else. And their inability to do that in some cases for various reasons is very difficult. And we also totally support living donors. Now, they don't donate to kill themselves, they donate a portion that they will survive. And there are situations in between that which have become an ethical question these days too, because of the current rules. Take the instance of, again, a tragic person with no brain left, maybe one of your patients. And, they still have viable organs, and they're eventually going to die. But they have no chance of any real function in the future because there is no brain. So no, as described, human real function. And the mother says, I want to go into this. Well, you can take out 2 kidneys, a portion of the liver, and the cornea can help some. He's being, in this case, maintained on a respirator. And we know as soon as you stop it, because there's no brain function to trigger breathing, that they will die. But removing those organs is not going to kill them. They're still on the respirator, they go back to the ICU, and they're still alive. So the surgery to remove those organs did not kill them. But then when you discontinue the respirator, they die. Is there an ethical problem with that?
I feel like we have a lot of smart people in the audience, and I know we'll get another chance to talk, because it's going to take sounds quite macabre, and I think it's what the process of declaring circulatory death after a patient's family has made a decision to have life support withdrawn is intended to address, so that you don't have the situation you described. But if I spend time talking about that, other people who have questions won't get to ask them, so we'll talk.
So, will you turn?
You might want to say more, but.
No, I wouldn't have a problem with that. I've already said that I endorse DCD.
So, could I go back to the organ donation issue of it? There's been a lot of talk about the sanctity of human life, but of course the lives to be saved by organ donation are equally sanctified and so on. And I've heard relatively little discussion about the sanctity of the life of the folks who might be saved by these organs. For example, in the case in which I would certainly disagree with you that a spouse should be able to override the wishes of the person who has just died, it seems to me that's ignoring the fact that these organs would have gone on and saved the lives or improved the lives of other people. I mean, it seems almost unethical to allow a spouse to say, I'm going to override my spouse's clear wishes and to save other people's lives because of some, who knows what, goofy reason for it. What about the sanctity of all those other lives?
Well, there are a lot of people who agree with you, and there are states where families are not allowed to override a person's advance consent to have their organs used for, procured for potential transplantation.
States in the US.
I think that's the direction in which things are
Right, moving.
trending quite significantly. I think that's why it's important, I mean, for me, I would disagree, I mean, two things. One is that I think that the sanctity of life doctrine is primarily about restriction on intentional killing. Now, obviously, that's predicated on the importance of the value of human life, but it doesn't justify just a simple, the numbers are what matters when we're thinking about that. But the reason that I think that it's important to frame this discussion about families in terms of the question of authority, I think there are good reasons to think that family members have the natural authority to dispose of the bodily remains of their loved ones. But the fact that they have authority doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to make the right decisions. People make legitimate decisions using their authority in ways that go wrong from time to time. What it means to say that they have authority is that when they make that decision, other people need to comply with it in certain ways, unless it's grossly problematic to the common good. It's not clear to me that in this case, I mean, the number of people who refuse on behalf of family members despite of the advanced consent that those family members have made to donation is actually fairly small. I think it was like 12 or 13 people in Great Britain 2 years ago. So I think it's not tremendously damaging to the common good, and there are important reasons to honor family authority in this context. So there are some costs, but that's true of acknowledgement of authority in any case.
I just also would like to say that presumes that the person who died would want the person to make authorities. Just sort of talking about relationships. So just because there's that technical relationship doesn't mean there was a close loving relationship. But sometimes family members do pop up at these times when they were not there for their whole lives, etc. Just another consideration.
Thank you for the presentations. I'm wondering if you can talk for a second about the relationship between the soul and the body within a Christian anthropology. Specifically, given that we are created as embodied souls, not only bodies, not only souls, but the embodiment of the two, there seems to be the underlying assumption that when the brain stops functioning fully, that the soul leaves the body. And I'm wondering if that is slightly problematic, especially given that with the evidence of the patients with brain death continuing to grow, it does seem like the vegetative level of the soul is still operating.
Okay, so this is a very good question. And it's so easy. No. Let me say two quick things about it. I don't think this is going to adequately answer your question, but I do think, I mean, one does relate to, I think, a disagreement that we would have maybe, although maybe not when we make the distinction between normative and ontological. I think if you think that the principle of life is a soul, as I do, that is animating material and stands as form in relationship to matter in that relationship, then I do think that you have to think that ontologically there is a moment of death, right? The soul is either doing that or it's not doing that. There's a process of dying, but it has to terminate in a moment. I am not committed to, I think, saying when that moment exactly is, and I think it would be very difficult to say that it doesn't happen, for instance, some moment prior to brain death when there's only the gag reflex. Maybe the soul has already left the body at that point, but I think the more restrictive criteria that we use, probably the better. But what I do think is the case is that we can have pretty good certainty with regard to some kinds of situations that the soul has left the body. A decomposing body is one in which the soul obviously has left. And I think, again, despite it being a philosophical argument, that my argument suggests, to me at least, that whole brain death is a sufficient indicator that the animating principle of the human being as a whole, the soul, has left, even if it's been succeeded by some new animating principle with regard to parts of the body, which is an idea that is at least the mirror image of some things that Aristotle and Aquinas thought about the developing human body. I think we have reasons for doubting that, actually, with regard to the developing human organism, but maybe they would have been correct about these sorts of things at the end.
I was going to say one more question, two more questions, and then we'll have to go nourish our bodies.
Thank you for your presentations. I have a question which maybe you can help me relate to the discussion. I work as a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst, so I've been interested in what has been maybe casually called the mind-body problem. And in talking about that with some people sometimes, I say that over the years, I've seen bodies or brains without a mind, but I've never seen a mind without a body or brain. And I just wonder if any of you could make that a little more relevant to the discussion. It's perhaps simplistic, but I find it practical.
So you have had the experience of seeing someone who doesn't seem to have a functioning mind, but has a unconscious functioning body, return to a place where they have a mind.
That could be too, yes.
Where, and would that come from the fact that their brain is now less swollen, more functioning? It is.
You have very astutely picked up on a very important underlying issue, namely the unconscious. And what happens with it, even if a person is not overtly functioning?
Yeah, hard to say. I very much sympathize with the really acute emotional, psychological, social experience of sitting with families at the bedside of someone who has been declared brain dead, but who, by virtue of the fact that they are warm and pink and their chest goes up and down because of the ventilator that they're attached to, is trying to grapple with the fact that not just is the mind gone forever, but that this body is dead. And that kind of counterintuitive mismatch is difficult for everyone. Even people who use all the cognitive apparatus that we've brought to bear on this question today with, very detailed parsing. It is still a human experience at the bedside of family members and friends who see what appears to be a living body that they're being told is dead. I'm not saying that shouldn't happen. I'm just saying it's extremely hard.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would just like to ask Professor Tollefson if he could briefly expound on you made a distinction between donor authorization versus consent, and you would like, when we check off on our driver's license, we're just authorizing. We haven't really considered properly to consent. How would we make that effort to get to that point?
I think the differences would include a greater amount of information being provided to, I mean, it's actually certainly nobody at the DMV, for instance, if that's where you're doing it, can answer any significant questions that you might have about what brain death is or what the controversies are. You know, I mean, suppose that Dr. Schumann is right. Then you're actually being asked to consent to something that will happen to your body while you're still alive. And the standard for most such interventions, for instance, if people want to do research on your body, are pretty high. You have to be given a certain amount of information in language that you can understand, and you have to be able to sufficiently be able to reflect on it and consent to it. And I think that something approaching that is the difference from what is the norm now in most places when you're simply asked, do you want to donate? Sign here if you do.
Or your surrogate decision maker has to make that decision on your behalf when you can no longer make it yourself. You know, the important thing is if you think you want to donate organs, you should talk to your family so they know what you want and what fears you have. So.
Well, this is certainly not the end of any discussion, but maybe a semicolon in a discussion. So thank you all for coming.